Every March 17th, the world dons green, raises a glass, and celebrates St. Patrick's Day. But behind the shamrocks, leprechauns, and parades lies a remarkable story of a man whose life was more profound than the legends he inspired. The real St. Patrick, he was a sinner, a slave, a missionary, and a man whose unwavering faith transformed a nation. His journey from captivity to compassion, from suffering to salvation, tells a tale that resonates far beyond the festivities we know today. Born around 385 AD in Roman Britain, Patrick, originally named Maewyn Succat, grew up in a well-off Christian family. His father, Calphurnius, was a deacon, and his grandfather, Potitus, was a priest. Despite his religious upbringing, Patrick admitted he had little interest in faith during his youth, preferring the pleasures of life. He was an ordinary teenager, drawn more to fun and freedom than to the spiritual teachings of his family. That all changed at 16, when Irish pirates raided his village, capturing him and many others. Ripped from his comfortable life, Patrick found himself bound and hauled onto a ship, facing a terrifying and uncertain future. The journey across the sea was grueling, packed tightly with other captives. With little food and water, the stench of fear and despair hung thick in the air. When they finally reached Ireland, Patrick was sold into slavery to a chieftain named Milchu. Patrick found himself herding sheep in the cold, desolate hills of Ireland. He endured hunger, cold, and profound loneliness. Each day blurred into the next, filled with exhausting labour and an ache for his home and family. He was surrounded by a foreign language, a foreign faith, and a people who saw him as nothing more than property. His former life of comfort and freedom became a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of servitude. Yet it was in this suffering that his heart turned towards God. The boy who once ignored his faith began to pray constantly, up to 100 times a day. And Patrick later wrote, "The love of God and a holy fear of him increased more and more in me." His captivity, though brutal, became the crucible that reshaped his soul. Each night, beneath the stars, he cried out to the God he had once dismissed. Slowly, he found comfort in the very teachings he had once shrugged off. His chains, though physical, no longer held his spirit captive. Patrick's transformation wasn't immediate. It came in waves, through freezing winds, sleepless nights, and his master's cruel demands. He began to see his suffering as a form of discipline, a refining fire that prepared him for something greater. He later reflected on how God regarded my low estate, had pity on my youth and ignorance, and consoled me as a father consoles his children. After 6 long years, Patrick experienced a vivid dream urging him to flee. The dream was as clear as it was miraculous. A voice told him, "Your ship is ready." Strengthened by this divine vision, Patrick escaped, embarking on a perilous journey over 200 miles across unfamiliar, dangerous terrain to the coast. He travelled mostly by night, hiding during the day to avoid capture. He navigated through dense forests, crossed rivers, and evaded patrols, driven forward by the belief that God was guiding his steps. Weakened by years of malnutrition and exhaustion, every mile felt like a trial. His feet blistered and bled, his stomach cramped with hunger. He foraged what little he could, berries, roots, and whatever edible plants he could find. Still, Patrick pressed on. He clung to his faith with every painful step, believing that freedom was just beyond the next hill, the next turn in the road. When he finally reached the coast, his ordeal was not over. A ship was preparing to depart, but the captain refused him passage. Defeated and desperate, Patrick turned to prayer once more. As he walked away, the sailors suddenly called him back, agreeing to take him aboard. To Patrick, it was nothing short of a divine intervention. The journey home was another test of endurance. The ship landed on the coast of Gaul, modern-day France, but they wandered lost for nearly a month, covering 200 miles of harsh, barren land. Starvation loomed, and the crew, pagans who mocked Patrick's faith, challenged him to ask his God for help. Patrick prayed, and shortly after, a herd of wild boar appeared, enough to feed them all. The sailors were stunned. Patrick's faith, unshaken by hardship, had left an undeniable mark on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Patrick made it home to Britain. Reunited with his family, one might think he would never want to see Ireland again. He was finally free, safe, warm, and surrounded by the people who loved him. But another dream changed everything. He heard voices calling him back to the land of his captivity, saying, "Come, holy child, and walk once more among us." The very people who had enslaved him were now the people he felt compelled to serve. It was a calling he could not ignore. Determined to obey, Patrick trained for the priesthood, likely under Saint Germanus of Auxerre in France. He was no academic prodigy. In fact, he often lamented his lack of education, but his heart burned with a passion to share the gospel. He returned to Ireland, not as a bitter former slave seeking vengeance, but as a missionary driven by an unrelenting desire to bring light to a dark land. Patrick's mission was daunting. Ireland was a land dominated by paganism and druidic priests. The cultural landscape was hostile to his message. He faced danger, opposition, and even carried a dagger for protection. But where others might have seen enemies, Patrick saw people in need of the gospel. He spoke to the people in their native language, told the story of Christ in ways they understood, and adapted familiar symbols, perhaps even the famous shamrock, to explain Christian truths. He met the Irish on their own terms, respecting their traditions while offering a better way. His approach wasn't one of force, but of compassion and conviction. He planted churches, baptized thousands, and appointed local leaders. His most famous convert was King Logar, whose eventual baptism marked a turning point in Ireland's spiritual history. Patrick's efforts laid the groundwork for a Christian culture that would endure for centuries. St. Patrick brought not only Christianity, but a new moral ethic to a violent, tribal culture. He preached forgiveness and love for one's enemies, a lesson he embodied by returning to serve the very people who had enslaved him. Patrick's humility shines through his own writings, particularly his Confessio. He describes himself not as a saint, but as a sinner saved by grace, writing, "I am a sinner, a simple country person, and the least of all believers." His life is a testimony to the transforming power of faith and the resilience of the human spirit. Yet his impact didn't end with his death. Patrick's work sparked a movement. Ireland, once a land of paganism, became a centre of Christian learning and missionary outreach. Monasteries were founded, preserving knowledge and spreading the gospel to other parts of Europe. In a world teetering on the brink of a pagan, barbaric supremacy, Ireland and Patrick's influence helped keep the light of Christ burning and save Western civilization.